and your systems are institutionally racist, rather than suggesting that any officer individually was racist. What I'm saying is actually worse than that. I am saying that we have homophobic, sexist and racist police officers serving in the Metropolitan Police Service, many of whom are regularly in the newspapers at the moment for misconduct complaints. And at the same time, I am saying that they treat each other very poorly with prejudice, and on top of that, there is institutional, systemic and organisational bias. So I think it's a really it's a really easy way, isn't it, to say, God, don't blame the guys and gals, this is just bad apples, they don't represent the thousands. What I'm saying in this report, and remember this is London, where 50% of the population isn't white, that actually it is totally out of kilter with the city that it serves. And within that, it actually doesn't treat people very well who are black. And to be honest, because of the choices they made around public protection, they ripped the heart out of the service they deliver to women and to children. So they know it. The police service know it. Officers know it. What we've had is people saying, finally, somebody's laid this bare. And I think that's the important thing today, is that we have laid bare in the last 48 hours the enormity of this. Police officers know it, and if we want to help good police officers that aren't racist and aren't sexist, let's stop being in denial about it.
OK, can I move quickly to James Daly, and then I'm coming to Diane.
Thank you very much, Chair. Baroness Casey, I have no confidence whatsoever, none, that the Metropolitan Police can change. And do you know the reason why that is? Because there's no evidence to suggest that they can. So let me ask you this one question. You talked about the current commissioner. According to what I've got here in front of me, he was an assistant commissioner for special operations from October 2011 to January 2018. What did he do between those 2 dates to address the problems that you've identified?
So I think that's a question you should put to him. I haven't looked at his personal track record. I take the point you're making. And I think I think what he said yesterday, that he was in the world of counter-terrorism and therefore wasn't particularly involved in some of these changes. I do think that it is time that we gave the Met a fresh start.
Can I just clarify, we haven't got much time. Are you saying that the person who is in charge of the Metropolitan Police now, as far as you're aware, didn't raise one concern about issues which were absolutely crystal clear during his time in the police? Have you got any evidence to suggest he raised it with any politicians, senior police, or anybody about the concerns as to how people are being treated?
No, I haven't, and I think you should put that to him. What is important here, though, is that if you just go down a structural route of changing the Metropolitan Police's structure, you let everybody off the hook again for the change that is needed in that organisation.
The point I'm making, Baroness Casey, is that you could have written this report, and it's a very, it's a horrifying report, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. I suspect somebody will probably write it in about 10 or 15 years' time, because the underlying thing is that people tell us what's wrong, but nobody ever addresses the solution. Nobody has said, as part of this report, the amount of, let alone the appalling behaviour, the incompetence, the basic incompetence is frightening, and none of those people will get sacked. None of those people will be reprimanded. Nothing will happen. All these people who've been incompetent at best and a lot worse for years, I'm not talking about the people under investigation, I'm talking about the senior police officers who were supposed to look after this organisation. Nothing happens to them.
Well, perhaps we will have the Commissioner in. I mean, I think we'll have the Commissioner in to put those points to him.
I think that's, yeah. I think as a colleague that's Conservative, I think you also have to read the part of the report that says over a decade, £0.7 million was removed from the Metropolitan Police Service. They had to lose money in very significant numbers, and they made those choices. And I think some of those choices weren't right in relation to some. But to blame this entirely on the shoulders of the Metropolitan Police retrospectively would not, in my mind, be fair. And also, let's remember that Stephen Lawrence lost his life 30 years ago. There have been successive governments that have not done anything to address the racism in the Metropolitan Police that yet again I have uncovered. But we have also uncovered many other issues that nobody has looked at before. And the key issue is actually what is making you angry, and I get it, is a sense of complete denial of their responsibility. They've got to do something about it.
Okay, thank you very much. Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to return briefly to what the Chair said about why should it be different now. You will all know that some of the issues you've uncovered in this review go back not just to Macpherson, they go back to the Scarman report in 1981, which I can remember. He stopped short of calling the Met institutionally racist, but he did write at some length about the effect of stop and search, disproportionate stop on search on minority communities. So the question is, if these issues haven't been dealt with, and of course you've uncovered a lot more, but if these issues haven't been dealt with in 40 years, why are they going to be dealt with now?
I think, and I hope, and remember I've given a time frame to this so that it isn't an open-ended ticket that they can just carry on, is I think that for the first time, actually, I think that we have looked at the management issues, we've looked at the cultural issues, we've looked at prejudice within the organisation, we've looked at how, frankly, they can't even manage their own data and analyse their own statistics and their own facts. So I agree, it's a pretty shoddy show that needs a great deal of change. But I do think that it gives them in a way that, if they don't take this and they don't use it, then I would happily come back before you in a year, 2 years, or even sooner and say, I don't think this is changing sufficiently enough. I do genuinely feel that we've laid it bare, we've done something incredibly thorough. If they don't see that there's a route map out for them from this, then I don't quite know what they would do. And as much as your colleague has said, Mark Rowley was there at the time, I think that they're potentially, the point I have therefore recommended and hope they accept, is that they can't do this on their own. So I think if you think of the other reforms that have happened within the Metropolitan Police, they DIY them. And what we have said is they must bring in people externally to work with them, like actually do their misconduct system. And I've recommended changes to his own management board with not just advisors but staff. And Sadiq Khan is going to chair a very different type of management board, again bringing in people from outside. And maybe I'm sounding defensive, but if they don't do it, I don't intend to stand by them.
We will definitely have you back. Definitely, yeah.
Vetting. A lot of people are concerned about how some of these people get in the Metropolitan Police Force in the first place. You say that vetting standards should be changed. Do you think you can expand on that a little?
If I may answer this one, vetting standards need to be tightened up. That's a national issue as well. It's not just for the Met. We have recommended a number of ways in which they should be tightened. But I think that it's more than just the vetting system itself. The vetting system has to be got right at the start when people are being recruited into the Met, but re-vetting has to take place as well. People should not be able to stay as police officers if they're not able to meet the standards of conduct that the public expect. And that plays into the broader management systems and so on that the Baroness Casey has referred to in the Met. The whole system needs to be improved so that officers' conduct is monitored and acted on if it falls short. We have also called on some changes to be made to the regulations around misconduct and so on as well, so that it is easier to deal with officers who don't meet the right standards. But that's not all that's needed. There are things that the Met can do and should be getting on with now to improve the way they deal with officers whose standards don't meet expectations.
Thank you. And just finally, Sir Robert Mark was one of the most illustrious Metropolitan Police Commissioners, and he came in the 70s, and what he did, and gets every bit of credit for doing, was cleaning up corruption in amongst the CID. I think more than 400 officers were sacked or sent to trial. Some leading police officers went to prison. But he came to the Met from Leicester. We came to the Met from an outside police force. And he said, I was reading his autobiography, that when he arrived at the Met, he felt like the representative of a leper colony attending the annual garden party of a colonial governor, which suggests the Met isn't interested in serious reform. And one of the other things he said in his autobiography is this: I have served in provincial forces for 30 years, and though I have known wrongdoing, I had never experienced institutionalised wrongdoing, blindness, arrogance and prejudice on anything like the scale accepted as routine in the Metropolitan Police Force. Are things any different now?
So it's really interesting that you quote that, because that's in our
report, yes.
in the report.
We use that quote,
exactly that quote. Because I think part of the problem with the Metropolitan Police Service, and probably to a lesser degree some of the others, but certainly the Met, is it is their sort of hubris and their closing in on each other in a way that's like this fortress, which essentially means that that gets in the way of everything. It gets in the way of, for example, when a police sergeant has been convicted of a criminal offence for indecent exposure, for doing a rather graphic version of that on a public train, they can actually keep him in the force as opposed to make the decision to sack him. So on so many levels, they close in on themselves, and that they therefore think that they are untouchable. And I think that what we have done with this report, and they asked us to do it, and we took full license from that, is that we have shown that the key findings really are exactly what you've described, which is this sense of optimism bias, defensiveness, denial, hubris, no humility, and all of that is standing in the way of change, whether that's about choices around vetting, whether it's around choices around misconduct, the way that you treat Londoners, the way that you treat BCU commanders, all of that is placed. Can I just mention one thing, if I may, that I think is interesting about police as opposed to other professions, and it comes to vetting. So I have worked in different parts of the public sector. I've worked in the world of sort of child abuse and children. I've worked in homelessness with people who are vulnerable. I've been up close and around various other difficult bits of the public sector. And I think what's really interesting is the police haven't moved into the 21st century in the way that others have. So we know, for example, if you advertise, if you want to get people into jobs where they are near to children, you have to have, even if it's not perfect, you have to have a barrier and a sort of vetting system, and then an inspection system that at least asks the questions, which they do in education and they do in children's services and other places. Like, are we going to attract the wrong people? So we know that paedophiles, for example, will try and get as close to children as they possibly can, and therefore you have to have, or at least systems in place to know that. What I found really interesting about the police is that there isn't really the same level of recognition that when you attract people into the police service, you know that the best of humanity might want to be police officers, the people that want to protect us, the people that are motivated by integrity and social justice. You also attract people that want power and actually want to abuse power. And I don't think, hence why on earth would their vetting systems allow people with, what did Carrick have? I think sort of 5 counts of domestic abuse in his background. You would actually see that as a red flare sign if you were in another profession. So I genuinely think that there are bits about policing that feel out of kilter with the 21st century. That would be one, and some of the accountability structures and no levers for change that actually also don't exist. But I've been quite struck from that one. So I think that's where vetting is a symptom of this wider lack of understanding that people that are attracted to be police officers might actually, although be great, you'll also get equal numbers that aren't great. And you have to have systems and awareness in place that we would have, in places where you're running services for homeless people, or where you're, involved in schools or any of those sorts of things. You would actually have checks and balances in place, and they don't have them in the same way in policing.
And at that point, we have a vote. I
So
really
that-
do
that's-
apologise.
That's wrong time, is it? Is it?
No, that's right. It's just come early.
Yeah, so we'll
come
just
early.
have
Let's come early. Okay.
the
Shall
meeting
we
while we
stay?
go and vote. If you don't mind staying, we'll be back as soon as we can.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
now that's come out in the open. My concern, and it was a concern when we went to see the standards department in Scotland Yard recently, is their solution to dealing with police officers who shouldn't be police officers, or investigating those who are questionable at least, is to bring in more police to mark other police's homework. And they seem not quite to understand the concept of what about people who are nothing to do with the police coming in to see whether actually they are fit for purpose and how you're judging. That would have greater credibility with the public, and trust, as you put in your report, is absolutely key to this, and it might put a completely different perspective on that. You've mentioned earlier about bringing people from outside. You keep using this phrase, give the Met a fresh start. They can't be given a fresh start with only their own people. Would you not agree to that? And also, their solution to misogyny is to bring in more female police officers, which is desirable. The solution to racism is to bring in more black officers, which is desirable, but it doesn't treat the underlying problem. It potentially gives the racists and the misogynists more targets to wield their malice on. The solution, surely, starts with leadership and a system that doesn't allow those misogynists and racists, homophobes, to get away with it. So they don't do it, and if there is any sign of it, the leadership clamps down on it like a ton of bricks. The police are not capable of instituting such a service themselves, are they, in the Met?
Firstly, I think we'd all like to answer that question, but because I think you're bang on, essentially. And so in terms of what happened on the misconduct, so we published our misconduct findings early at the request of the new commissioner in September, October. And the organisation's first response was to get 150 officers to join the people that have been failing to do it properly, just add another 150 officers to them, taking those officers from other parts of the Met that they might have been needed in. So I couldn't agree more about what you've said in relation to that. And I think there are two reasons why the Met need to bring in, I think we use the words, a new independent multidisciplinary team should be brought into the Met to reform how it deals with misconduct cases, with a particular focus on how it handles sexual misconduct, domestic abuse and discrimination. So that is a really clear finding for me, and it's a really clear recommendation that I hope they accept. So one is I don't think they're very good at it. So why let the same people do it who've been doing it badly? And secondly, I don't feel reassured by the people that have done it badly to just add more people to it. So there's a kind of assurance exercise to people like me that I can look at women and say, no, it's okay to make a complaint. It's all right to make an allegation. And secondly, they need to put their house in order. And I do think actually in relation to that very early commissioner that you were referring to, that cleaning up the Met has got to be one of the most important priorities. I couldn't agree more. My heart sank when you realise that some of the strategies that they've deployed in the past is just about getting more women in or getting more people of colour in. And then you look at the strategy for doing that and you realise they haven't got a hope in hell of achieving either of those things until I'm probably, I might even not be around, but I'll certainly be well into my pension years. So there is no plan B, you see, on some of these issues. They just go on. So they say, oh, we'll put more people in misconduct. We've got to do better on how we recruit people. And they don't do either of those two things well, which is why I think what follows from this report has to be more than a turnaround plan. It has to be a much more wholesale plan. The other thing, can I mention, because I think you hit the nail on the head, is Neil wrote the bit, which is the diary of initiative-itis, which, if it weren't true and, something that was more account to in the thick of it or W1A, it would be funny. But actually it's incredibly tragic because they do initiative after bloody initiative after initiative, telling people to, up their standards, that do this. And one of the one of them, they went in the wake of poor Sarah Everard's murder and the sentence of his murderer. They, in the wake of that, did something called Rebuilding Trust, which is well-intentioned. But within that, they then had something called Not in My Met. Well, actually, they had an emergency one called the Depp's Top 3 Asks, where he basically says things like, be good, be this, be that. Just I can't remember what they were, but they were like, up your standards. That then translated to a diktat going out across the Metropolitan Police, where essentially everybody had to count the number of times that the Depp's top 3 Cs were mentioned. I mean, honestly, you couldn't script it. Flash forward to the absolute reputational nightmare is how they saw it of some of the things that happened in the Met Police, and they came up with something called Not in My Met. And Not in My Met says, don't be racist, don't be sexist, don't be homophobic, and if you are, please leave.
Yeah.
Please leave. No, I'm going to root out and find you.
There's a couple of things I want to ask you, as we are shorter of time. So, I mean, there's lots of good observations and suggestions here. A lot of it is about bringing in advisory people from outside, bringing scrutiny people from outside, which is all good. But you need to bring in executive people from outside. So you need to have, do you not, at the highest level, assistants, commissioner and deputy commissioners, whatever, people who come from a completely different background, of which the army is a prime example, or business leaders, about completely overhauling the institution. Because as you and I know in particular, when you're looking at problems around child abuse, say, it's about how did the system allow that to happen, not just about how did the individual professional allow that to happen on his or her watch, but how would the system allow this level of misogyny and failure to go on? And you've got to have somebody who doesn't come from that system, who has executive powers to do something about it and call out the problems, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely, Mr. Loughton, and you know that because of your previous world. Number 13, the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, building on their recent material, should bring in new specialist expertise from outside the Met in permanent rather than advisory roles to overhaul the management of the organisation, lead on the work reforming the culture of the Met and the creation of, this extraordinary workforce
plan. That still sounds a bit advisory. I want them in senior leadership positions running police departments.
We've made it abundantly clear by saying they have to be in permanent rather than advisory roles.
But permanent executive running police officers, not advising permanently on how the system could work better.
Honestly, double checked it, but that's what we're putting
fine. Well,
there.
if that's your intention, I think that's really clear.
It's our intention, Mr. Loughton. Whether the next commissioner does it to the degree that we want is a different matter.
So that's my next question. So have you had any discussions with the Home Office or indications from the Home Secretary as about what continuing role you may have to make sure that your report doesn't just gather dust on the shelf?
I haven't had any.
Would you like to? Are you putting yourself forward for such a role?
Well, I didn't think anybody was going to ask me that question, so I'd have to have a think about it, to be honest. I mean, my view is that the Home Secretary's position is, and she made it clear on Monday when we did have a call with her and the Policing Minister, that she has full confidence in the new leadership of the Met and that she wants to make sure that they have her full support in order to get the job done.
And for all the reasons we've just discussed, police marking their own homework is not the solution. So do you think, whether it's you or whether it's one of those few other people maybe up to your calibre who could take the baton on from you, that this needs to be a progression report so that there'll be in a year's time, a 2 years' time, 3 years' time, somebody seeing what progress has actually been made with the power to call out where progress has not been made and where it's gone in reverse or failure has happened, and for that to lead to something actually then changing even more drastically?
I have made the offer that I think that, on a periodic basis, a year, 2 years, I put 2 years in the document, either myself, and I've offered myself, or somebody like me would come back and provide themselves, provide you, provide the Commissioner, provide the public with the assurance necessary. Now, just ahead of this, my prediction of what will happen is it's unlikely anybody will ask me to come back. number one.
Why?
Because they'll find it all too difficult, etc., rather than being brave. I'm just being honest, I could be wrong, I haven't had a conversation with them. The other thing that people will get up to is they'll pick certain bits of what we've talked about and ask people to review certain bits. Really clever and actually stupid move if you're actually looking for reform, is that what you'll get somebody to do is to come in and have a look at, I don't know, misogyny, let's take an easier one. You'll get somebody else to come in and assure themselves. In fact, there's probably already somewhere in that building something called Operation Assure. I mean, I'll put money on it as the sun comes up and goes down. So what will happen is organisationally, people will start to do those sorts of things. And what I'm trying to say at the end of my recommendations is you kind of need a breathtaking, so leave people to get on for a period of time, then you have a breathtaking moment again, where you inhale the breath of whether you think change has really happened, and you live with the consequences of somebody that says they're getting on with it or they're not getting on with it. But what I have said, and I stick to it, Ms. Loughton, is that if they haven't made sufficient progress within that time, and I have no power in this at all, it is my own view that somebody should then look at how you would split it up or change it or reform it in a much more significant way. But at the moment, remember, we have Lynn Owens, we have Mark Rowley, and we have a change of leadership at the top. Assistant Commissioner Gray has long experience of the move from RUC to PSNI. That's the type of scale of reform that we're talking about. And I think if they take what we've said in this report seriously, and I think they are, then at the moment I would say don't split them up, don't change them. But I think you're utterly right. Bravery around having somebody look at you is the best way to make sure you get reform.
Can I just be clear? Your review team, they all finish. This whole thing now just goes away.
I'm afraid so.
And the ownership of the report is with the Met because they instructed you in the first place or asked you to carry out the review.
Yes, I mean obviously we're very clear. In fact, we've got an extremely well-qualified person who leads the review team sitting behind me. We will obviously make sure that the evidence that we've gathered and the anonymity of it is carefully handled, and that we will use the National Archives as some of what we do, but we will hand over the actual report to them, and it is up to them to implement it. And yes, I'm frustrated about that, and our team have worked relentlessly on this. Like, it's all that we've done really for the last 12 months. So we are nervous about handing it over and letting people press ahead, but everybody has to be grown up, including us, and we have to see them and let them get on with it for a bit. I'm not used to this, but I'm learning to handle it. Not very well, but...
Right. Okay, and just finally, what would be a reasonable amount of time for that breath to be taken about change? Whether that's happening?
My own view is I think it's 2 years in minimum, and I would probably start trying to look at some key things at about a year. You shouldn't really get the clean up right. I think the cleaning up should happen within a year. What you can't do is gift an organisation cleaning itself up for a long time, because you need to know that the recruitment, the vetting, the systems are right at the same time that you're changing the bar on. I mean, Lucy Dorsey at British Transport Police, I think she's on something like her 17th accelerated hearing for misconduct in about 6 weeks. So, and to be fair, I think Barbara Gray is not short of doing that as well. But once you get your system right and you get your clean-up right, there should be a time limit on that, I think. I don't think you would want to know, particularly, for example, that if you're black and a police officer, you're 81% more likely to be the subject of a misconduct complaint. I mean, if that sort of statistic doesn't change within a year, then I'd ask myself whether they're getting that system change right.
Okay, thank you. Paula Barker.
Baroness Casey, thank you to you and your team for the report and for being so candid. You spoke earlier about a police officer who indecently exposed himself on a train. That police officer is still a serving police officer, and we've heard in the last few weeks in the Home Affairs Select Committee that about 1,000 officers are now being re-investigated, re-looked at. Do you think the threshold and process for dismissing officers is too high?
Yes. I think, yes, there's a brief answer. Yeah, without a doubt. And I think in a way that's part of some of the culture within the police that, you know, you can get away with it, as it were, or that their standards, oddly, are slightly lower than they would be in other walks of life. And, you know, that case is coming up a lot, but there are countless examples of that. And I think what's very difficult for now Chief Constables and Mark Rowley within that is that what they're seeking is powers that will allow them to reopen it. And they're trying to find ways to reopen some of the cases that actually probably most people in this room would think, not sure they should carry a warrant card. My one thing I'll add to it is that I think we feel very strongly, though, that the Metropolitan Police could do an awful lot within any of the regulations and rules they've already got. So there is, again, another little culture between let's split it up, choose what we're going to do, and then get people in to tell us it's okay, and show and tell. The other culture is, I think, that they will literally split this down and basically say, well, we can't do this. When I'm saying they, I'm probably really going to the culture of the Met rather than any individual. But the idea that, you know, we can't do without the regs. You know, can't change anything unless the regs change. It's the regs. I mean, it'd be where the Metropolitan Police Federation would be at, which is nothing to do with us. This is all about the regs. You know, that's a classic line, isn't it?
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I think one of the things is that in dealing with some of the misconduct that we've heard a lot about, all you do is follow the regs. So, you know, things like repeat offending or repeat behaviour will keep happening because they're not looking at kind of patterns of predatory behaviour, etc. Now, you'd think that they look at the regs and go, well, this doesn't meet the threshold, and the threshold's pretty vague because it just means, I think, behaviour which amounts to gross misconduct, which means someone might not be in the force. So, you know, that's not very clear, is it? So they don't look at patterns of behaviour. They don't look at behaviour escalating, so they don't know what predatory behaviour looks like. That's what that tells me. They might be able to recite the regs, but I think it's where you need specialists coming in who actually understand, and you would hope some police officers themselves would understand as well, about these kind of patterns of behaviour. And that's the kind of thing that we need in the Met, and actually they brought somebody in last year who was a specialist in that, and I think one of the consequences is you're seeing a lot of cases coming forward. But that's the kind of change that you need to see.
I mean, it's quite stark, really, isn't it, when you see rape convictions as an all-time low, and one of the women police officers who was systematically raped and abused by a male colleague, and there were 6 different investigations over a period of 2 years. And that's actually happening inside the Met. It doesn't exactly instill confidence in women and girls who are walking the street who may be subject to sexual violence to actually come forward and report their abusers. Just wanted to touch on what you think are the potential barriers that the existing legal and regulatory framework may create, and any reform that is required around that. Is there any of those barriers?
I think there are some recommendations in the report which are about helping the Met to clean up its act. So one of the examples that we've talked about earlier is in terms of vetting. So the Met are kind of re-vetting to an extent all of their officers. But it appears that if it's established now that someone shouldn't have passed their vetting, they can't actually get rid of them. Because so that's another of these sort of Kafkaesque sort of regulation things that don't seem to have been addressed. So we have a lot of sympathy with the need for regulation to sort of facilitate the exit of some of those people. The others are where cases a power to reopen cases where legally where new evidence has come to light.
And I assume you see a role for the Police Federation in that as well.
Well, their role will be that they will endlessly defend the fact that those powers aren't needed, and that we're just kicking police officers and they've got terrible terms and conditions. The Met one, not the national one, but the Met aren't that pleased with our report, so I'm not that pleased with the London Metropolitan Federation right now. But I mean, just coming to the point, I mean, this is just so staggering that if you think that David Carrick, multiple rapist, had 9 non-crime incidents between 2000 and 2019, 5 public complaints, including the one where he dragged a woman down a staircase by her throat. He got through his initial vetting in 2001. He passed his probation in 2003, despite the fact that they knew if they'd looked, if they bothered to look, which is what Jessica did behind us on all of these cases. He passed his probation in 2003. God alone knows how. He had checks done to become a firearms officer in 2009, so we knew about the DV. You know, nobody checked, and this is what's so staggering about this organisation. And then he was re-vetted in 2016 that was delayed by 5 years. And people are saying, I'm being tough on the cops. I'm being tough. They treated those women with utter disrespect by not making sure that their systems were able to do what is common sense in another organisation. In any other organisation, that you would put 2 and 2 together. And if one of those women hadn't heard Susan Everard's victim impact statement reported in the news, it was because of her coming forward that that man was stopped. So the stakes are incredibly high, and I suppose that's why I feel quite powerful in how I'm trying to convey to the new commissioner, the deputy commissioner, and every single serving police officer is, are we going to allow this organisation to be incompetent and also in denial about the fact they will rather protect a man like him than they will protect their own women, black people that work there, and the people they're supposed to serve, remember, not be a force for. So, you know, the stakes are incredibly high. I'm incredibly frustrated that we need something that comes back that actually gives us reform here. And you're so powerful. You know, you are the Home Affairs Select Committee. We're not. We're a band of mighty annoying people trying to put the evidence together to persuade you and everybody else to do something about it. We've got the evidence and we want to persuade people to do something.
Thank you.
Thank you. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Baroness Casey, and your band of annoying people for everything you've been doing. This is an incredibly powerful report. Always dangerous, but I'm going to quote you back to yourself. You said a few minutes ago, if it can't be fixed, then it needs reforming completely. You've already suggested 1 or 2 years for the time frame. I'd love it if you had a bit more detail around how long you actually think the Met has to get this right. And also, what should we be looking at in terms of measures, metrics, as to what improvement looks like for them?
Yeah. So in the review, we have suggested a progress review in 2 years and in 5 years, but we have also set out at the end of our recommendations a set of measures that we suggest the Met are held to account on, including improvements in public confidence, and particularly amongst those communities in London who have traditionally and for a long time lacked confidence in the Met. And I'm talking about Black Londoners in particular, but there are other groups, and all groups across London. Confidence and trust in the Met has been falling in recent years. So that is one of the measures. Other measures include improvements in response times, and improvements in charge rates, the effectiveness in cleaning up crime effectively. So there are a series of measures that we've set out, and we think those should be looked at on a regular basis and transparently and publicly, and indeed that should be a focus, we think, of the new policing board that we want to see established to oversee the Met and to oversee the kind of reforms that we're recommending.
Thank you. And in your conversation with the Home Secretary on Monday and with Sir Mark over the last few days, do you detect the appetite to follow those measures and to work to that timeline?
Yes, I think a lot of those measures matter already. Baroness Casey and others have referred to the Met's existing sort of draft turnaround plan, and I think they have recognised in there the importance, for example, of public confidence as a measure. But I think, you know, one of the points of the review is the comprehensiveness of the issues and the interconnectedness of these issues and the need for wholesale reform. So rather than taking a tactical approach and looking at one indicator or another and focusing on single issues, as it were, it's really important to look at the whole piece and to look at the progress across the piece.
And again, thank you. Again, from that same engagement, so the regs which you touched on, and they're in your recommendations around giving more power to the Commissioner to reopen investigations and layer on additional sanctions if he thinks they're not strong enough. Do you take the view that, again, the Home Secretary is willing to give you or give the Commissioner the powers to make those decisions?
Yes, I think where the Home Secretary appears to be, and she said it at the dispatch box yesterday, is wanting to give police chiefs the powers around misconduct and disciplinary in the way that they have been requested, and we have reflected them in our own recommendations. I suppose I just want to reiterate again that I think that the size of reform needed, I feel, isn't necessarily quite as well understood as I might like it to be, both within colleagues in the Home Office, in terms of the size of reform. Now, to be fair, they, only got the report, seconds or whatever days ahead of whenever everybody else got it, and it is 360 pages. So I completely understand that will take time. But I think people need to see that it's not an either-or, and I would say that to the Home Secretary, that she stood up at the dispatch box and rightly said, I support Mark Rowley, I support Mark Rowley, I support Mark Rowley. So every time she got a question, she said, I support the new Commissioner, I support the new Commissioner. Now, you can say that and do that, and that is right, but you also have to say at the same time, by persuading enormous reform and change. I support the Commissioner by putting new powers in place where needed, but in the meantime supporting the Commissioner in being brave and bold about the level of the reform required. And I suppose I feel it's a little either or, and it has to be both, the same way Neil is right. If you read the report and then you see the conclusions of the recommendations, you can see that you can't pick and choose them. They're not a pick and mix. They have to be taken together. It's kind of one chocolate bar, not optional bits and pieces. And I suppose that's what I'm slightly concerned about, is that because, if I'm being gentle and kind, I would say there hasn't been a great deal of time for people to see the depth of what we're talking about. And I think, certainly 48 hours now, if not longer, of media, on quite a monumental scale, probably has brought attention to it. But I think it's not I support Mark to do whatever he wants, as it were. It's actually the job of government is to support the change needed in the Metropolitan Police by supporting Mark Rowley. Does that make sense? And I think to me, I'm slightly worried at the moment that the size of reform required is of the size of sort of RUC into PSNI, but driven by different reasons. And I'm not sure that I'm hearing at the moment, and that could be because I'm concerned that it won't work, and that in 20 years from now, somebody will be sitting before you saying that Casey review in 2023 laid it bare and nothing changed. That's my, from my old people's home, if we still have them, that, hopefully with lots of sherry, that's what will be happening. And actually the serious side of what I'm trying to say is that they have to accept the reform now, and I'm worried that the size of the reform isn't reflected in what the Home Secretary said yesterday, because it's you can't just, I'll trust him, let him get on with it, no matter how brilliant that individual is. And that's my worry. And that's where I think Mr. Loughton is right to say, to be fair, good question to me, do you think that the checks are right? Do you think the balance is right? How soon? I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to say one last thing about the word institutional, Chairman, if I may.
Yes, please do. Yes, please
so,
do.
I've been thinking about this, that Mark has inherited an organisation and possibly, dare I say it, a culture that is sort of long on hubris and quite short on humility. And it is my own view that right now, the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner and the report that we have given allows them to be bigger, to be the bigger ones, to leave their hubris to one side and to sort of say, wouldn't it be good if we honoured Doreen Lawrence's son? Wouldn't it be good that we honoured all the Black Londoners whose mums right now are thinking, is my child carrying a knife? Is he going to be stopped and searched? How will he be stopped and searched? You know, people telling their kids as they grow up, don't look at a police officer if you're black. We all wanting to tell our children to run to police officers. Black families and non-white people haven't said that for some time. And I think, you know, really in honour of that, Mark needs to be bigger than the sort of headline or the word, and needs to remember we all have to be bigger sometimes than that's what being in public life is about. That's the responsibility that we carry as public servants. And I suppose that's why it's for me really about an end to hubris and a beginning of humility. And that's why it's important, and that's why the words are important, Chairman. And that's really any support that you are all able to give in a cross-party way to that would be so enormously grateful.
Well, I think we're very grateful for your time this afternoon and for your band of annoying people for getting this report and producing such a, an excellent piece of work. Can I just ask two things very quickly? One thing that occurs to me is this accelerated misconduct hearings that I've been hearing about that other police chief constables have used. The Met don't seem to have used this. Is that correct? They don't seem to have used it in the numbers that other chief constables feel able to use it.
I think there's been fewer accelerated hearings. That's definitely right. They use the legally qualified chair system when they feel they haven't got a kind of slam dunk case and they haven't admitted it. Again, it's very heavily reliant on. It is very, very heavily reliant on regulations, and we think they could probably do better on both parts. We're not saying we haven't said that legally qualified chairs aren't able to to come to a good decision. They're panel decisions, and we certainly think that that's not the root of the problem here. So the answer is not let's have loads and loads of accelerated hearings, but it is for the Met to get their cases together well.
Yes, I think we'd just be very surprised that an officer who's caught masturbating gets a conviction in the courts, is not put through an accelerated misconduct hearing.
He was put at misconduct.
He was put.
He was. And back at Met Culture,
he wasn't dismissed.
He wasn't dismissed. He was given a written warning.
They understand what gross misconduct means?
No, that's what we write in our report, sir, is that we don't think they understand fully what gross misconduct means.
And very finally, I just wanted to ask you, are Freemasons a problem in the Met?
What sort of questions there?
Because I think in the past people would have said that the Freemasons had an undue influence in the Met, and there's no reference to the Freemasons in your report. So have they completely gone away as a problem?
Whether they have gone away or not, I don't know. What I can say is lots of things came up. We asked lots of questions. They are in the report where we were clear whether it was an anecdote, a soundbite, a quote, a piece of testimony, a bit of evidence. We can prove every single word from every single person in that report is true, and that we can prove that their systems are at play to make that happen. So it didn't come up significantly as an issue, and therefore it isn't in the report. Chairman, would you just indulge me one final thing? I've spent the year thinking about the fact that we were commissioned in the light of Sarah Everard's death. And I think when all of this stuff gets into the media and all of those sorts of things, and people were chasing for headlines and running to get what we'd said out, and Victim in the Guardian going, oh, exclusives, and I was so irritated by all of that, particularly that. Because I felt that we have tried so hard throughout this review to do it in a way which would honour Sarah Everard's memory, her family, Mina Smallman, her daughters, the families of Stephen Port, who killed those 4 young men, and then finally the 13 victims that we know of Carrick, 12 of whom were sentenced, and one, for various reasons, wasn't. And I suppose I just wanted to say, and I probably won't have another chance to say this, is that the reform needed really is on behalf of them. And, we have a system of consent in this country, that the public decide what our laws are and how they should be changed. You make those changes in Parliament. That's what you do as parliamentarians. You, on our behalf, make those changes. Then we ask the police to hold those changes on your behalf and our behalf. That's gone horribly wrong here. Consent is broken in London. And I feel sort of in honour of the last 12 months of the victims of some of these police officers, we owe it to them to get change. And you have the power there, much more than me. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
I think that's very, very powerful. And we will be coming back to this. We will be, I'm sure, wanting to speak to the Commissioner. And we will, I think, want to invite you back as well, in perhaps a year's time, to see where things are. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Minister on his own.
So we will resume our session. I'm very sorry to have kept you waiting, Minister. We had a vote in the middle of the first panel.
Don't apologise, I completely understand.
Yes, it was a very important session that we, as part of our policing inquiry. But we're very glad to see you with us today. And I wondered if you and your colleague would like to just introduce yourselves for everyone so we know who you are.
Of course. My name is Tom Tugendhat and I'm the Security Minister.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Stewart and I'm the Director of Prevent in the Home Office.
Yes. And the purpose of this one-off session is to look at the review produced by William Shawcross, which was published at the end of February this year. We have about an hour, I think, in this session. So I'd just like to start us off. Minister, whether you're able just to give an overview of the current terrorist threat in this country.
Well, the current threat is substantial, as you will know, and the reason for that determination is because of the level of threat that we see around the nation. It's balanced, as you'll be aware as well, with the reality that in some areas it'll be slightly higher than others, but we've got to set an appropriate level that works for the whole of the United Kingdom. It's true, of course, that Northern Ireland often has a slightly separate determination, and so this is really something that we keep a close eye on the whole time. And at the moment, as I say, it is substantial.
And where is the threat coming from?
Well, the threat is varied. We're aware, first of all, of course, of Islamist terrorism that has been an issue in the UK over many years, and also of extreme right-wing terrorism. And as an example of both of those, sadly, we've seen, even in our own, amongst our own colleagues in Parliament, two examples. One, Joe Cox, who was so brutally murdered in 2016, and the other, of course, David Amis, who was murdered only just over a year ago. And so we see that even here we're experiencing it. And of course, 6 years ago today was the utterly brutal attack on Westminster Bridge that took the life of a few people, but of course, particularly close to us was PC Keith Palmer, who paid with his life for his extraordinary courage. I think we should all pay tribute to him today.
Absolutely, and we did at the start of our first session. We remembered him and the people who died on Westminster Bridge as well. And also, I think you may want to mention Rosie Cooper, who, as a former member of this House, she was her life was threatened, wasn't it, through one of the extreme right-wing terrorist groups?
You're, of course, absolutely right. There have been others who've been in this House whose lives have been threatened in a different way. Ruth Smeeth, as we know, who required police protection due to anti-Semitic threats. Baroness Smeeth, of course, as she is now. And others who have faced extreme ideological violence against them and have required police assistance to keep them safe. So I'm afraid this is not a problem that has gone away. And while it is certainly extremely present, sadly, amongst the parliamentary community, it is also present in a wider community. And one of the things that we're seeing as well is we're seeing the increasing connection between state violence and terrorism and ideological connections. You'll be aware, of course, that we recently identified the threat that Iranian-connected activists opposing to the Jewish and to the Israeli community in the United Kingdom. Sadly, that level of anti-Semitism has increased in recent years, as we all know.
Excuse me. And of course, the prevent is about trying to stop people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorist activity, isn't it? So that's what it's about. So the review, whilst it was, I think, saying it was broadly right in its objectives and admirable in its intentions, and there was lots of good effort going in, there were concerns raised about how Prevent was actually operating. And one of the concerns was about the number of referrals into Prevent. Do you want to just say something about that and about what because of course the government have accepted all the recommendations from the Prevent review. So could you just say something about that particular issue?
I will, absolutely. And it's important to note that the number of referrals is high. It's some 3,800 have been referred and have come out the other end. So it's not only high, but it's also productive. This is a system that has worked, has diverted young people, mostly young people, away from extremist ideology, and in that sense has not only protected the whole of us as a society, but also those individuals who could otherwise have been radicalised into violence. So this, I think, we should see very clearly for what it is, which is an attempt to protect everybody in our society, including, actually, most particularly those who are referred. Ironically, are the ones who are first protected, and then others by association. So this is something that we have, I think, we have led on in many ways, and in conversations with colleagues around Europe and elsewhere, it's quite clear that others are looking at the work that we're doing, not just in Prevent, but in the other elements of the contest strategy, to make sure to learn from our work and to see how they can adapt and improve it for their own circumstances. This is a programme, of course, that depends on responding to the ideology that's prevalent at the time. And so it is something that we're constantly working to keep up to date. It would be true, for example, if we were to talk about this 50 or 60 years ago, we'd be talking about violent Republican ideology, particularly connected to Ireland, or 100 years ago we may be talking about anarchist violence. So this is something that we would have dated at different times, and now we're updating it again, and the work that William Shawcross has done is to make sure that we are as up-to-date as we can be.
He seemed to be of the view that there may be reasons why people were not being referred through to Prevent because they might be accused of being racist. And you've accepted that?
So look, I'll touch on this because I think it's an important thing to address, that the balance of referrals has not been what we would expect, given the latest prosecutions and actions that we've had to take against individuals. It has been overrepresented in that sense in extreme right wing. Now, it could simply be, of course, it is possible that it is simply that those who are doing the referrals notice one and not the other, and the police later notice the other and pick it up. But it's also possible that in a misplaced cultural relativism, people are allowing a soft bigotry to tolerate a cultural misunderstanding that pretends that there is in some way a tolerance for Islamist extremism in a way that there quite rightly shouldn't be for extreme right-wing extremism.
And is there evidence of that? Because I was trying to look at the report, the review, and see where the evidence for that was.
So at the moment this is a supposition. We're collecting further data. The data isn't exactly clear at the moment, but we are working on that because this is something that would be of great concern. I mean, let's be absolutely clear that referring people to Prevent for being radicalised into Islamism is something that many in the Islamic community are now doing very actively. Now today, the first day of Ramadan, and many people will be getting together in family groups and indeed across communities for iftar in a few hours' time now, in order to come together as a community and identify, and celebrate family and this religious festival. Those who notice and who call out extremist ideology in their community are doing a service not just to themselves, but also to the individual and also to the wider society. And I think that's something that we've got to get ingrained, not just in mosques and community groups, but actually in schools and other areas. Because what we've seen, and in fact I had a conversation with one of our colleagues this morning, a member of Parliament, I won't refer to, but I'll refer to him generically, who told me about a mosque in her community where they were specifically asking for extra help in reference to Prevent, because they see the benefit. And I think we're getting to that place amongst many in the Muslim community. We're not quite in that place in some places in wider education and so on, and this is one of those areas where we have to do better.
So just going back though into the referral and using channel, you're saying that you haven't got any evidence, it's just a supposition that you think that people are not being referred in or being put into the channel process because there's some view that they've... I wasn't quite sure what you were saying, to be honest. Perhaps you just explain that to me
Of course. So the numbers don't add up at the moment. And because the numbers don't add up, we can see that there's a lacuna, and what we're trying to do is to explain the lacuna. Now, we have some suppositions for that, and we have some anecdotal evidence for that. What we need to do is to build up the evidence base. Michael, would you like to... Forgive me, Michael may be able to add a bit more.
Yeah, thank you, Minister. So, Chair, it might be helpful to make a distinction here between referrals and acceptance onto the programme. So there are about in 21-22, which is the last year for which we've published figures, there are about 6,400 referrals to Prevent. About 800 of those actually make it through to Channel, which is our primary intervention programme. But as the Minister says, at both those levels, at both the referral level and the acceptance level to Channel, there's quite a big difference in percentage terms between what we see in the balance of extreme right-wing and Islamist casework in comparison to what we see in the Pursue system, where MI5 and CT Police say about 75 to 80% of the overall cases are Islamist and 20% the rest, mostly extreme right-wing. That is not what we see either at the referral or at the acceptance into Channel stages. As the Minister says, what the report identifies is that disparity exists. The report doesn't describe to us actually why that's so. So, as he has said, we're in a position of collecting a significant amount of data on that so we can understand that better. I think it's also worth reflecting something else that William recommends, which we are accepting, is something called the security threat check. So in future, we will have an examination of how the risk and threat looks from Prevent and how it looks from Pursue, and seek to marry them together. That won't necessarily lead to a linear relationship in the percentage of casework, but it will help us understand if there is a difference, and if that difference exists, why.
Okay, right. I think we might come back to that in a moment. Paula Barker.
Thanks, Chair. In 2020-2021, there were more referrals made for extreme right-wing concerns than for Islamist concerns. Why do you think that is, or why do you think that was? Sorry.
Well, that's partly the point that we were just addressing with the Chair. It's hard to be absolutely certain, but we think there is an element that people in some communities are more likely to refer extreme right-wing terror concerns than they would Islamist terror concerns. And there are many suppositions as to why that might be the case. One is that there is a misunderstanding of what is culturally acceptable and what therefore might be an inspiration to radical ideology in some communities rather than others. And I think that's what I mean by the bigotry of low expectations. I think we've got to be very, very careful that what we're doing is we're holding not just everybody to the same standard. I mean, that's quite clearly the right thing to do, but that we're protecting everybody equally. It would be quite wrong to see a program like Prevent, which can protect people from falling victim to ideological indoctrination, and only use it to protect some members of the community and not others. And I think that's a danger that we've got to address. I think that's one of the things that Mr. Shawcross identifies in his report, and there's more work to be done on it.
How long do you think the analysis will take on that? Because obviously he does identify it, saying that the RICU operates different standards for what highlights as Islamist and extreme right-wing threats. So how long will the analysis take?
So I don't think RICU operates different standards. I think it's a slightly different challenge, if I may. And I know Mr. Shawcross mentioned it, but I think that the challenge is that what we're seeing that interpretations of it vary. And so it's a different challenge. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on that. I'll give for a timeline, I'll ask Michael, if I may.
So two things on that. I think, as the Minister's rightly pointed out, the RICU conversation is a slightly different one. And Chair, I think it's important to reflect that RICU worked directly for me, so I have a specific interest in this. The RICU bit is, for those of you who've looked at the 2018 contest strategy, there are 3 bits to Prevent. The bottom bit of the triangle is the tackling causes space, and that's mostly where RICU speak. And William's observations around that are that we have been out of balance in terms of the products we put forward, in terms of more analysis of right-wing and less analysis of Islamist in comparison to the threats they present. So I think that's a slightly different question to the understanding the middle bit, the conversation we've been having about the relative disparity of casework. And there are 3 bits to understanding that middle bit. Work is going on now, led by my teams, to look into those cases that have taken place mostly over the last year in a dip sampling way to give us a better understanding of that. I've touched on already the security threat check process, which we will begin this year. Both of those 2 pieces of work will definitely be done and give us a good sense within 6 months and certainly within a year. But it's also important there's some independent verification of that beyond me, and that will be a more involved academic process, which we are discussing now, and I think that'll take over a year.
Can I just ask about the recent announcement about the government service that will warn if there's danger to life nearby in terms of the tech service? Why is that being brought in now? Is there any specific reason?
Capability.
Right, okay. So there's no other reason other than capability?
These programs sometimes take a while to get online, and it's now online. So it's an update. We're very pleased.
Obviously, it stated that it could address flooding, fires and extreme weather. Could you see it being used in a terror situation?
It's something we've considered, and you'll be aware that public information is essential in moments like that. Quite how it's deployed and where it's deployed will depend very much on what the challenge is. Look, there's been a lot of work done by psychologists in recent years on that old analogy, shouting fire in a crowded cinema. You don't want to do that and cause a stampede or cause further harm. So how it would be used and where it would be used is something that still requires work, because of course if you're sending out a text message, you can't assume that everybody sees it at the same moment. You can't assume, there's an awful lot of information that you won't assume is treated equally. And so it's a different challenge to have an immediate threat as opposed to a longer term one. So a flood that may come in 24 hours maybe more amenable to this service than an immediate threat in other areas.
That's helpful. Thank you.
I'm going to come to James Daly, but I just wondered if you'd had a chance, Minister, to read the Intelligence and Security Committee report on extreme right-wing terrorism, because they say in there the continuing rise in the number of referrals to Prevent for concerns around extreme right-wing activity does not necessarily signal a similar increase in the extreme right-wing terrorist threat, but rather indicates a greater awareness of the potential risk and the greater focus being placed on this issue. So that might be the explanation.
Absolutely, that's one of the possible explanations.
Yes,
that's right.
Would be quite a reasonable explanation,
Yes.
rather than people being worried about being racist.
Well, the reality is we have a combination of possible reasons, Chair, and I don't want to discount them.
Okay.
What I want to do is to find out what's the best way of making sure we keep our society safe and keeping individuals within our society safe. And that's why I think the ISC has done some really important work on this. Others have done work on this. And there, I'm afraid, we have found in admittedly anecdotal evidence that in some areas people are less willing to refer when it may be Islamist in a Muslim context, which, as I'm sure you would share with me, is absolutely unacceptable. To suggest that Islamism is, acceptable in Islam is as wrong as to suggest right-wing views are acceptable in any other culture.
Yes, absolutely. Right, James Daly.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Minister. Prevent was created in 2003, but it would be fair to say it doesn't work, wouldn't it?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
It would be fair to say it doesn't work.
I don't agree with that, actually, Mr.
Can you give us some evidence to suggest it does work?
Yes, I would be very happy to give you some evidence that it does work. What you can see pretty clearly from the statistics is that many people go in, are referred into it, and end up being completely ordinary members of society only a few years later. It is a programme that has definitely demonstrated a capability.
We're referring people into it who may not have terrorist sympathies, and after they finish, they still don't have terrorist sympathies.
Well, that's one interpretation. Alternatively, we're referring people into it who do have terrorist sympathies, which is what the evidence shows through the Channel programme, and after a few years, they don't.
Do you think there's a better way of doing this, Minister? I know you've had the Prevent programme has come, as the relatively new Security Minister. Although I accept everything you say, I can't exactly see our European colleagues following the grand example of Prevent as being the way to address things. Is there a better way than Prevent?
Well, our European colleagues are following it, and nobody yet has found a better one. We're constantly looking around, and so you'd be right to keep challenging. That's absolutely part of what we've got to do to ourselves. But when you look at the incidents of terror that we've seen in the United Kingdom and the way that we have been able to challenge some of it, I'm not saying it's 100% successful, that would be absurd, but when we see the way in which that it's been able to divert some people away from violent extremism, that's got to be seen as a success. Look, this is not an attempt to reprogram people who may have views that we don't agree with. It's an attempt to help people step away from violent extremism. It's quite a narrow aim if you look at it specifically. We're voting again.
No.
Oh.
Just a final question. As an example of this, in terms of the what Prevent does in some ways, is actually replicate services that should be there in the community. If somebody's got mental health issues, and the mental health issue is that perhaps one of the main reasons as to why somebody's been referred into it, it seems odd that Prevent is the way of addressing the mental health issue rather than through other services in the community.
You're completely right that there are some incidents of referrals that frankly should not be referrals to Prevent. They should be referrals to mental health clinics. That's completely accurate. And it's certainly true that there is some evidence of overlap between extremist views and mental health issues. And so sometimes they should be referrals to mental health clinics, sometimes they should be referrals to Prevent, and sometimes, I'm afraid, they should be referrals to both, because the reality is the overlap is very high. But what we need to do is to make sure that we're getting people into the appropriate level of care. Now, the challenge we've got to have is we've got to make sure that when we refer people who may have mental health issues as well, What we're not doing is putting people who would care for them into positions of severe vulnerability when we also know that they may have terrorist sympathies as well.
Thank you very much.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us, Minister. I'm interested in incel culture, not personally, I should say, but Shawcross argues in his review that people who are influenced by that culture, or fixated on school massacres and areas like that, shouldn't be covered under the PREVENT programme. Do you agree with that?
I think what Mr. Shawcross does is quite rightly challenge us on that. We have involuntary celibacy is very often an indicator, but I think we're very far from convinced that it is in itself violent extremism. Now, the reason I'm slightly cautious about this is we have seen incel-related attacks in other countries. We haven't seen it in the UK, but we have seen it in other countries. And the same is true of school shooting. We thank God we haven't seen school shootings here in the UK for many, many years now, and I'm glad that our gun laws make that particularly difficult and therefore more unlikely. But we are keeping our eyes open to the different ideologies that motivate in different ways.
Thank you. The reason I ask is we've had briefings as a committee looking at incel culture and how it may start as involuntary celibacy, but actually the individuals involved in it move across the spectrum,
right,
essentially looking for an outlet of hate that best serves them. And organisations like Community Safety Trust and others have done deep...
That's why I was clear that it's more of an indicator than an ideology in itself. It may indicate that the individual is looking for an outlet of some kind, even if we haven't yet identified what that ideological outlet may be.
Great point. So if you think it's best served outside, if that group of individuals are best served outside of the PREVENT programme, where do you think they should then sit?
Let me just be quite cautious. I didn't say they're necessarily best served outside the PREVENT programme. They may or may not be. And this is where the PREVENT programme is there to assist when people have been referred in. The best people who can judge who should be referred in are the people who are working with others in the community. It's very difficult to set hard and fast rules from Westminster, from Whitehall, when actually the human variabilities in our communities are so great. So there will be many indicators that may trigger a referral, incel views being one, but the purpose of PREVENT is to prevent violent ideology. So a referral may not be the wrong thing. Channel, the programme that then works with people, may be a better way to filter. So I'm not willing, and I'm very keen that I don't, deter people from referring if they feel that that is an appropriate action. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Like you, Mr. Fell, I spend quite a lot of time thinking about incels, but not from a personal perspective. And I think it's fair to say across the counter-terrorism system, inevitably, the edges of PREVENT will always be fuzzier than the edges of some of the other, where the statements of an understanding of what terrorism is are clearer. And as the Minister says, we wouldn't want to be in the position where we were discouraging people from making referrals, even on this more marginal stuff. But I would absolutely share his view. Our understanding, and it's by no means perfect, but our understanding is the really large majority of people involved in incel culture are sad and unhappy, but not violent. But there is a small violent subculture, and that's what we need to look at. As the Minister's touched on, that's also true for school shooting. And back to Mr. Daly's question, so I spend a lot of time talking to my opposite number in the United States, where of course they have a significant school shooting problem. And much of the methodology we adopt when we're actually thinking about taking people onto our programmes is remarkably similar to the way they do, even though the ideological nature of that is even fuzzier, but it isn't necessarily non-existent. So we do need to continue to be a broader church than the rest of the counter-terrorism process, I think.
Thank you very much.
When you said people, you mean men, don't you? It's men who are incels. It's not people. It's not women. Women aren't incels.
Almost entirely men.
Yeah, it's men. Okay.
So just two things on that. You're quite right, but this is a reflection actually of how things can be abused. The incel movement was originally started by a woman in Canada who had absolutely no violent concepts whatsoever, and it has been exploited in this way. But you're right, Chair, more broadly, of course, across prevent casework, about 90% of the casework we look at is men.
Thank you. Lawton.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Minister. It's always good to have ministers for their debut performance in front of the committee. We're always very gentle. Isn't it the case that Prevent actually drives extremism underground?
No, I don't think that's true. I think what Prevent has suffered from due to some relatively high-profile campaigns is a perception that that might be the case. The reality is actually it has extremely good engagement with many members of pretty much every community, actually. And we find that even in communities that we are told by some loudmouths feel that it's victimization, the communities themselves actually choose to engage with it. And we see this certainly in mosques and community groups across the United Kingdom.
We took evidence some years ago on a different inquiry, I think it was to do with hate crime and racism, from university academics who were very concerned that Prevent was effectively snuffing out free speech on university campuses because people didn't want to express views which could be construed as extremist, which could make them candidates for the Prevent programme. And they were very critical of the Prevent programme. Have you seen evidence of that?
No, we haven't seen any serious evidence of that.
No, I think that's right. I mean, this is, again, a criticism I have seen repeated on a fairly regular basis. The Department for Education produces statistics on its effectively safeguarding programmes for university speakers. The number of people who are refused an opportunity to speak on the grounds of Prevent-related grounds is really, really tiny. We haven't seen any broader indication that that chilling effect does exist because it appears to us all the issues which are of interest to us are discussed quite vibrantly on university campuses rather than being driven underground.
Okay, but I'm not talking about cancelling speakers, and that's why we've got the freedom of speech legislation on university campuses. I'm talking about ordinary students who may be harbouring extremist views and who may have previously been engaged in debate or slightly more offensive behaviour which would have revealed those extremist views, are now hesitant to do so, and they seek other fora.
Let's be clear, the purpose of Prevent is to stop people from turning to violent ideological movements that would threaten them and threaten others. That's what it is about. It's about the prevention of, it comes under the contest strategy very specifically because it's about preventing terrorism in our country. Part of the purpose of that is to help people who are being radicalised not to be so radicalised. It is absolutely right to make sure that those views are challenged, and if in challenging them people don't hold them anymore, and therefore you don't hear them anymore, that is a success, not a failure. That's not the same thing as a cancel culture, where you're choosing not to debate in order to simply have an easier time of your own ideological pursuits. Rather, instead, it's about making sure that violent views that genuinely threaten to drive people towards extreme action, not just thought, are challenged and put in their correct place.
That's my point, isn't it? Because if people feel that they are vulnerable to being pursued by a Prevent programme operation or whatever, being identified for that, by speaking their views and having those views challenged in open debate, be it on a university campus or education establishment, wherever it may be, then they are likely to go underground and to seek refuge with the extremist organisations that Prevent is trying to stop them going into their arms, because the jihadists don't openly recruit at Freshers' Fair.
They did.
Well, if they did, then they can be challenged, but the really dangerous ones do not. Those are exceptional circumstances of where pseudo extremists have presented themselves. But mostly it's done underground, on the internet, and through personal contacts.
Your point about the direct connection between people on the internet as opposed to in open forums is absolutely true. That is due to the nature of the change in the way communities operate and the way we all communicate, and that's, I'm afraid that's just a fact. There's nothing I can add to that. It is certainly true that we all communicate more in, if you like, private communications, not necessarily secret, but private communications rather than open forums. That's correct. I don't think it is correct. In fact, I have seen no evidence to justify the claim that Prevent is in any way having a chilling effect on open debate in either universities or any other public forum. I think what it is doing is helping those who are on a path to radicalisation to step off it. Now, I think that's a very important thing to do. I think it's important to protect the individual concerned, but more importantly, it's important to protect the whole of society. And I think that is exactly what a community like ours should do. Because I don't think we should accept violent ideology as a norm. It isn't a norm. It's not normal in our society. It is an outlier, and it's an outlier in various different groups. We've spoken about Islamists, we've spoken about extreme right wing, and in the past, and certainly at some incidents, we've seen left-wing anarchist and single-issue ideology leading to potential acts of terror as well. So we know that ideology can lead to violence. And it is absolutely, I think, the job of the state to protect individuals, and in doing so to challenge ideology that may lead people to violence.
Can we touch on the issue about proportions of Islamist extremism and right-wing extremism, which was obviously a major observation by Shawcross, and I think his figures, so out of the 4,915 referrals to Prevent, 22% were related to Islamist radicalisation, and slightly more, 25% for extreme right-wing ideology. And yet in terms of those people who then ended up being in custody on remand for terrorism-related offences, 70% are categorised as Islamist and 22% as extreme right-wing. So he claims that the Islamist threat is severely underrepresented in the Prevent referrals. Is he right on that?
Look, I accept his report. I accept his report because he has demonstrated through the numbers, through the data, that this is a challenge that we haven't got correctly balanced, and he's correct on that. What we need to do is to find out the reasons for that misallocation and seek to make sure that it's better represented. Now, as Michael put it earlier, and indeed as the Chair put it earlier, there are potential reasons for that. One is, as the ISC put it, due to the growing prevalence of understanding that right-wing violence is a serious threat and therefore should be treated with the seriousness that is appropriate. Another is, as I've mentioned, is possibly cultural misunderstandings or unwillingness to challenge on various areas. And there may be other reasons still that I haven't covered. And so I think that it's important that we recognise that the way in which we engage with communities has to be treated equally, so that what we're doing is we're actually recognising that individuals of whichever community have the same rights of protection as anybody else, and the whole of society has the same right of protection from anybody who challenges it.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to dispute that, but why do you think it is that there is a higher representation of pursuing right-wing extremists than there is on Islamist extremists? I mean, the months you've been in this job, you must have formed, and certainly since that report, you must have formed a view. Are cultural sensitivities which led to grooming gangs by predominantly British Pakistani men going undeterred largely, because cultural sensitivities, counterbalanced by it's more fashionable to go after right-wing extremists?
So that is one of the theories.
Do you think that's right?
I think it's a theory that requires quite a lot of further investigation. And that's why what we're doing is we're working with groups like Educate Against Hate, and we're working with many other groups across the country to make sure that what we're doing is we're helping to educate teachers and other community groups who may be, people in the community who may be having those level of contacts, to see that what they're seeing is or isn't normal. Now, as I say, today is the first day of Ramadan. Many people will be practicing their faith in ways that will stand out in some communities. Now, to stand out is not to be extremist. To stand out is not to be in any way a danger or a threat. To stand out is merely, in some cases, to be practicing your religion. On Ash Wednesday, many of us as Catholics will have a black mark on our forehead. That's hardly an extremist symbol. And there are many other things that people do culturally that may be simply a reflection of the cultural practices they follow, either religiously or personally. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't some aspects which are indicators. And that's where we need to help teachers understand the difference and other people in the community understand the difference and therefore recognise where there's a challenge and where it must be addressed.
Do you know how many children have been taken into care from parents who have been deemed to be extremists?
I'm going to turn to Michael, I'm afraid.
So I can't give you a precise answer, but the numbers will be extraordinarily low.
How many do you think is extraordinarily low?
I don't want to give you a precise answer because my understanding of this would be more based around the children who have returned from Syria than from children who are based in the UK, and I'm not clear enough on the second one to give you a specific answer.
Okay. Can I tell you it probably runs into hundreds over several years, and it's not dominated by Syria. And I'd be interested to know how many of those parents were then identified for a PREVENT programme.
So the mechanisms would certainly exist in those circumstances. If a child had been taken into care because of their parents' extremist impact on them, I would have expected that already to be part of the PREVENT system if the specific driver behind taking a child into care is extremism.
Okay, I think it would be interesting to have those figures because there have been some high-profile cases of children taken into care, for example, because parents were UKIP activists some years ago. There were genuine cases which were challenged, but there are many other cases of children taken into care because they have parents who are identified with genuinely extremist, either right-wing views or Islamist views, and I think it's more, and other extreme religious views, and I think it's more to the latter. I'd be interested to know, one, what the overall figure is, because I'm slightly out of date with it, but it's more than I think you assume, Mr. Stewart. And I'd like to know if a substantial intervention as taking a child into care is automatically followed by that person then being referred either to a PREVENT programme or some other restrictive activity, because clearly if they're dangerous to their own children, then they must be dangerous to society as well if that danger is based on their extreme views.
So I'm quite confident that no PREVENT referrals occur for a person being a member of a UKIP, either the individual or their parent. Absolutely confident that would not fall within even the broadest definition of extremism. Clearly, any case...
that's the case, but there were some cases of kids taken into care because of that, not referred to PREVENT. I want to know who's been referred to PREVENT.
Yeah, clearly any case of child protection is always challenging in terms of reporting in the public domain, not necessarily covering some of the sensitivities of it. But I will take a look at that for you. But my strong sense is that we are not in a position where significant numbers of children are being put in care because of the primary driver being the risk their parents pose to them because their parents are extremists.
Thank you.
Just following on from this point, there's been concern that RICU's listing certain works as flags for potential extreme right-wing terrorist interest, including The Great Escape, the poetry of J.K. Chesterton,
E.K. Chesterton, yes.
sorry, and even Portillo's Great Rail Journeys. So,
dangerous programme.
Is that correct?
Without wishing to comment on Michael Portillo's clothing, I wouldn't describe any other element of that programme as extreme. And I should say very clearly that RICU doesn't either. What RICU has done is it's listed, possibly without enough warnings as to exactly what it was doing, but it's listed what an extremist said were products that that person felt were extremist. But the idea that G.K. Chesterton, who, as we all know, wrote the most fantastic Father Brown books, or that Michael Portillo's Great Railway Journeys are in any way extreme, is completely absurd. Right. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Okay. Can I ask you about recommendation 25, which is about ensuring that Prevent Money does not fund, work with or consult with extremism-linked groups or individuals? How widespread is this?
Well, this is something that we've been looking to address in various different ways, and we've been, as you know, concerned that some groups that claim to represent communities across our country are actually much more interested in spreading division and hatred in various different ways. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that none of these groups have access to any funding at all. And as you know, Chair, that's something that the Home Office can work on, but cannot prevent every group in the country, every government, public sector organisation in the country from acting on. So this is something we're working on.
You don't actually know what the scale of it is?
We have some idea of the scale of it. Would you like to go into the detail?
So William looked at this very carefully, and I think it's important that he did, because it is clearly absolutely central that public funds should not be going to organisations which are themselves extremists. Mm-hmm. William found a couple of examples from a number of years ago. Myself and my teams have then looked through this again, and I don't see this as a problem that's happening now. However, both the Minister and the Home Secretary have asked for stronger due diligence, a stronger role in making sure that we're examining this in detail going forward, and that both the Security Minister and the Home Secretary have a clearer sign-off. So
okay.
I don't think it's happening now.
A couple of instances a few years ago, but nothing at the moment.
That's our understanding.
Why is he writing that you need to be looking at this?
Because he's right. He's absolutely right. This is definitely not something we should be even slightly...
Absolutely, but there isn't any evidence that it's happening.
There is evidence that it happened in the past.
In the past?
Yes.
Okay, so... Okay.
And just on that, Chair, we absolutely have to have zero tolerance of this. We can't have it under any circumstances, which is why...
No one's disputing that. I think it's just statements being made, and when you say, well, where's the evidence this is a problem, it's a bit frustrating that you're saying, well, a few years ago there was a couple of instances, but it's not happening at the moment. It just seems a bit...
I think, Chair, you'll recognise it's a very long report, it's a very complete report. It's one of the reasons I think it's a very good report, is that Mr Shawcross has looked at many areas where either lessons have been drawn and made sure that they're reinforced, or indeed, more challengingly, looked at areas where lessons need to be drawn and has made those recommendations.
Okay, can I also ask you about the Prevent staff that you have? Perhaps this is Mr Stewart's main, really, about the skills and the capabilities that you need. Could you just talk a little bit about that? Because there's obviously concern that you haven't got the right staff in place with what Mr Shawcross is saying in his report.
Thank you, Chair. So about 150 staff work directly in Prevent, and then about another 100 I fund who are employed by local authorities. So it's a reasonably small effort by overall government standards. My sense of Prevent staff is that I have a strongly motivated, often in many cases highly specialist workforce, and I see people, particularly in the local authority area, move from one local authority to another because they are passionate about Prevent. And that is one of the most innovating and energising parts of my job, seeing that. In skills, I think the challenges we have, as we've touched on earlier, is that the risk picture is changing all the time, and our ability to keep up with that is always a challenge, but I think we do well on that. as the Minister has touched on, the proliferation of online skills are really important here, and I have a group of specialists who are working specifically to consider how that plays out. That is also a challenge because the online position changes so quickly. William is definitely of the view that the understanding particularly of Islamist extremism within Prevent needs to improve, and we're very much committed to that. But William also, in a further recommendation, says he wants to see more of the work in-house rather than delivered by consultants, and that's what we're already doing, which for me is a reflection of the confidence I have in Prevent staff.
Okay. Paula Barker.
Just on, Mr Stewart, on the 50 that are employed or you fund to work in local authorities, I'm assuming that's because in those specific areas there's high numbers of risk. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's right. So our philosophy, and again William touches on this, our philosophy is that we have a series of Prevent priority areas. Across England and Wales, every local authority has a duty to deliver on Prevent, but over years we have developed a methodology in which we have looked at the highest risk areas. William notes correctly that that is probably a little bit out of kilter now with where the threat is, because the threat feels more, sadly for us, balanced across a range of regions. So today I just have over 40 Prevent priority areas. Based on William's recommendations, we will be regionalising more strongly, and that number will fall to about 20 over the next couple of years.
Thank you. So do you think that will help in terms of making sure the right referrals are made and the right people go into the channel programme? Because it seems to me if you've got the 40 local authorities that are the high profile ones, there's lots of other local authorities that may not have access to the expertise that you've just been talking about from staff being able to assist in making decisions. So are you expecting that regional process will result in better decision making?
Yes, I do. I don't think that's the only reason why. So there will be a series of regional advisors employed directly by the Home Office who will help, particularly for those areas who are unfamiliar. But that's not the only thing to improving the referral process. The Minister's touched on this already, and so does William. The quality of our training products to frontline practitioners, if you are a teacher, if you are a health worker. We already have a range of training products, but we need to make them sharper, particularly on the ideological points, and I think that will be another key in improving the quality of referrals.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything, Minister, you need to say to us or tell us about, or you're concerned about?
No, I don't think so. I'd just like to thank Mr. Shawcross formally on record and to thank you for your interest in this area of work. I think this is enormously important, and it doesn't stand alone. There are, as you know, 4 areas of the contest strategy, and this is one. But it is an important element, and it's rightly challenged frequently. And so having this ability to explain what its purpose is, and I look forward to reading your report when it comes out, to hear how you feel it should be engaged and how it should engage with others. I think it's an essential part of democratic debate. I think we should compete in the ideas space just as we compete in others, and this is important.
Thank you. And we have asked to speak to Mr. Shawcross, actually, and we were hoping he might be able to join you today, but that wasn't possible. So we would like to see him. So if you do come across him, perhaps you could say we are very keen to speak to him if he'd like to come and...
May I just say, I know he is keen to do it. I'm afraid, able to organise his diary for him, but I realise he's very keen to do it.
Good. Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.